When you stop and think about it, our society is kind of like a huge, complicated game. We've all got our own goals, we're all interacting, competing, working together, and just like any game, for it to work without total chaos, it needs a good set of rules. But that gets you thinking, right? If our whole society is a game of the rulebook, which is basically the law, then what are the rules for the rulebook itself? I mean, who makes sure those rules are fair, that everyone actually knows them, and that they're applied the same way to absolutely everybody? Exactly, because any game worth playing needs a fair rulebook. So today, we're going to explore the actual blueprint for our legal system. We're talking about the absolute bedrock principles that make sure the whole game is played on a level field. And that journey starts with the first, most basic principle of all. You've got to know the rules. It sounds so simple, right? But seriously, think about it. How can anyone expect you to follow a rule if you have absolutely no way of knowing it even exists? That's not just some philosophical musing. It's a core requirement for justice. Well, the answer is laid out for us right here in Article 2 of the Civil Code. This sets up a deal, a non-negotiable pact between the government and us. Before any law can actually affect you, before it has any power at all, it has to be published for everyone to see. The government can't just cook up a law in secret and then, bam, punish you for breaking it. Publication is absolutely mandatory, period. But, getting to this crystal clear rule was a bit of a battle. The original law from 1950 had this one kind of tricky phrase, unless it is otherwise provided. And some folks tried to use that as a loophole to just skip publishing laws. That is, until 1986. In a huge case called Tañada v. Tovera, citizens actually took the government to court over it, and the Supreme Court came down hard, ruling that publication is an essential part of due process. You can't skip it. Ever. This whole thing led to a new order that made laws even more accessible by letting them be published in any major newspaper. Okay, so the state has a duty to tell us the rules. Now, what's really interesting is the flip side of that coin, the duty that falls right on our shoulders as citizens. Think of it like this. Article 2 and Article 3 are two sides of the very same coin. Article 2 says the government must make the law public. In return, Article 3 says that once it is public, we are all presumed to know it. They're totally inseparable. The government does its part, and in exchange, the whole system has to work on the assumption that we've done ours. And this brings us to one of the most famous and, let's be honest, kind of harsh-sounding phrases in all of law. Ignorance of the law excuses no one. You just can't get out of a speeding ticket by telling the officer you didn't know the speed limit. And this isn't designed to be cruel. It's a rule of pure necessity. Can you imagine the chaos if anyone could just say, "Oops, I didn't know"? The entire justice system would grind to a halt. But hold on. Here's where things get really interesting and a bit more human. Is there a real difference between not knowing a law exists and being genuinely mistaken about the facts of a situation? The answer is a huge yes. And understanding that difference can literally be a matter of life and death, which the incredible case of Ah Chong shows us perfectly. Let's go back to 1910. Picture this. Ah Chong, a cook, is in his room late at night. The door doesn't have a good lock, and he's on edge because of recent robberies, so he keeps a knife by his bed. In the middle of the night, he's jolted awake. Someone is trying to force his door open in the pitch-black room. He yells out a warning, but the person keeps pushing. Believing his life is in danger, he lunges forward and stabs the intruder, only to discover it was his roommate. So, what happened? The Supreme Court acquitted Ah Chong. They found him not guilty. Why? Because he didn't make a mistake of law, he made a mistake of fact. A mistake of law, like saying I didn't know stealing was a crime, is never an excuse. But a mistake of fact can be a totally valid defense. It's like accidentally picking up a phone that looks exactly like yours. You know the law about stealing. You were just wrong about the fact of whose phone it was. Ah Chong knew the law in self-defense, but he was mistaken about a crucial fact: who was breaking in. Since his mistake was honest and reasonable, there was no criminal intent. This brings us to the next huge pillar of fairness: time. Just imagine you're playing chess. You make your move, and then, after your turn is over, the referee suddenly changes the rules and says, "Hey, that move you made yesterday, it's illegal now." That would be insane, right? Totally unfair. Well, the law agrees. This is called the principle of prospectivity, and it's right there in Article 4. It basically just means laws look forward, not backward. You can only be judged by the law that was actually in effect at the time you did something. This gives us stability. It gives us predictability. It means you can't be punished tomorrow for something that is perfectly legal today. But of course, there are exceptions. And the most important one is all about fairness. If a new law comes out that actually reduces the penalty for a crime, it can be applied backwards to help people who are already convicted. This is about equity. If the state decides an act isn't as serious as it once thought, it extends that benefit to everyone. Other exceptions are things like laws that just fix clerical errors in old laws, or laws that change court procedures. But the big idea is retroactivity is only allowed when it helps, not when it hurts. Okay, so we've got rules about knowing the law and applying it fairly across time. Now we're getting to the really heavy stuff, the unbreakable pillars. These are the rules the legal system puts in place to protect its own structure and its own integrity. Article 5 is a massive safeguard. It says that any action you take that goes directly against a mandatory or prohibitory law is just void. It's legally nothing. It's like it never even happened. For instance, a contract to sell illegal drugs isn't just an unenforceable contract. In the eyes of the law, that piece of paper is a legal black hole. It was void from the second it was created. And right after that, Article 8 gives us another pillar. It says that when the Supreme Court interprets a law or the Constitution, its decision isn't just some opinion. That interpretation actually becomes a part of the law itself. This is a powerful doctrine called stare decisis, which is just a fancy way of saying courts have to stand by what's already been decided. I like to think of it as a waterfall of justice. The Supreme Court makes a ruling up at the very top. That ruling flows down, creating this powerful, unified stream of precedent. It becomes the law of the land, and every single lower court in the country is bound to follow that stream. It's what ensures the law is applied the same way in Cebu as it is in Manila, creating a stable and predictable system for everyone. All right, to wrap things up, let's take a quick look at how these fundamental rules draw the lines around our own personal freedoms, and even how the law reaches across borders.
We all have the freedom to give up or waive our own personal rights, for sure. You can totally forgive a debt someone owes you, or you can say no thanks to an inheritance. But that freedom hits a hard wall where the public good begins. You can't, for example, agree to work for less than minimum wage, because that goes against public policy. And you definitely can't give up a right if doing it is going to hurt someone else or the community.
And here's a cool little peek into what happens when laws from different countries bump into each other. For Filipinos, your personal life, things like your marital status, your family rights, is governed by Philippine law, no matter where you are on the planet. That's lex nationale, the law of your nationality. But your property, that's a different story. That's governed by the law of the place where it's located. That's lex resitae. So your passport dictates your personal laws, but the physical location of your house dictates its legal rules. So here's the bottom line. All these articles, these rules for the rules, they aren't just dry, dusty text in a law book. Not at all. They are the living, breathing, operating system for a just and fair society. They're what guarantees our government is transparent, that ignorance isn't an escape hatch, that the law is stable, and that the entire system stands on a solid foundation of reason and fairness. And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. We've seen that judges have to make a call even when the law isn't totally clear. So that forces us to ask, when the old rulebook is silent, where does real justice come from? Does it come from sticking to the absolute letter of past laws, or from finding a way to interpret those laws to meet the real needs of the future? That's something to think about.